Hey everyone, Duke Nuke 3D here with an extremely important mask to the collecting community for me to review for you guys. And today I have for you Johannes Möller's reproduction of the BF Goodrich Koroseal mask. Before I get into this reproduction, I'd like to mention that the Koroseal mask was an experimental design that was designed by I believe it was Charles Legullian of the BF Goodrich company, which was essentially a Kops Tiso Monroe or KTM mask, which was made entirely of a transparent plastic material which was used for tablecloths at the time, known as Koroseal, with the hopes that the US military would look into it and adopt it as a sort of mask that would allow soldiers to identify each other, being that the facepiece is made of a transparent material. Kind of similar to what we would see later in the 1960s with the XM27 and XM29 prototypes and so on and so forth. But anyways, the Koroseal was ultimately rejected, and no surviving examples exist of it. Johannes Möller, who was the founder of Gas Mask Lexicon and one of the original first-generation collectors, who sadly is no longer with us, I believe he passed away in 2014, made a reproduction, a very loose one. I don't know if he was exactly trying to reproduce it. I know that he references it. If you look in his US Industrials page and click on his Polmasan respirators, he erroneously attributes the Koroseal to being a Polmasan design for some reason. But he also references the fact that this is a reproduction of the Koroseal, although I am not entirely sure if that was his original intention or if he was simply just trying to experiment with how the face pieces were constructed. And for what I assume might be a first attempt, or at least an early attempt, it's a very faithful trial of what it was supposed to be, but there are a few things different. For one thing, obviously, the entire face piece is made out of a very thin black rubber, as opposed to a tablecloth material being transparent, known as Koroseal. And there's just so many differences that are so off from the Koroseal, but, it's just an interesting piece of history that's sadly starting to degrade, and I'm doing my best to preserve it. But anyways, back onto this. So, what's also very interesting about this is that it's also an experimental mask for what would become the Studio Gum masks. I'm sure some of you may recognize Studio Gum as a fetish company. However, Johannes Möller was actually the founder of Studio Gum, but sadly, attempts to contact the current owner of Studio Gum and get information on this mask have sadly not been fruitful. In fact, when we contacted Hans, the owner of Studio Gum, the current owner, he pretty much had nothing to say. He just said, "We're sorry, Johannes is not with us anymore, and we cannot tell you anything about this mask." So, what we have here is an extremely rare oddity that not even the current owner of its original company acknowledges. This mask started so many things. Like, for one thing, it was an early example of gas mask collectors trying to reproduce and understand the history of early gas masks, and also it was the start of a very notorious fetish company. So, yeah, without further ado, let's get on to the actual details of the face piece other than just a vague description. So, as mentioned before, it is made of a very thin, probably about 3mm thick sheet latex, which is made pretty much the same configuration as a KTM or an M1 style service mask, where it has a very similar chin seam pattern, except instead of being sewn, it is glued latex, and the seam is holding up very well. I'm very thankful for that. You can see lots of dry rotting throughout the face piece. This thing is very flimsy and floppy. In fact, if I take this off the head, this thing would entirely buckle in half. This thing is not very rigid at all. The eyepieces are made out of a sheet plastic, and this is where we're assuming this is the mask that's, well, other than the account of Johannes' son, this mask uses the same style of lenses as the Studio Gum masks, where it is a ring of rubber which is cemented onto the facepiece, which retains the sheet plastic lenses. It's very interesting. I kind of like this concept, but the harness, as you can see, is a 6-point harness, and the head harness here is actually probably recycled off of more than likely a Burrell Kops type. It could be wrong. It could be off of a an M2 service mask of some sort. The buckles, which as you can see have no longer got their finish on them, I'm probably going to restore that finish. Whenever I get some brass darkener in the mail, I will restore those buckles back to a black finish, although I might not. I don't want to mess with it too much. All I know is that having exposed brass and copper, both non-ferrous metals, is not very good for rubber, so that's the main reason why I would want to restore the black finish. The angle tube assembly, as you can probably notice here, is not an entirely scratch-made design and is actually stolen off of a Burrell Cops type. It would have been originally painted black, but JJ, or Johannes, whatever you want to call him, has stripped it down to the bare aluminum finish with only remnants of the original paint intact. The flapper valve is fully serviceable and functional, it's very flexible, and so is the hose. This would have originally come with a Lake Erie Chemical Company tear gas filter or Type G filter, one of those tall gray filters. I do not have it with me since I was only loaned the facepiece for study and for restoration, more or less. The only thing that I have done to this facepiece to restore it, other than give it a treatment with silicone spray, is to basically remove all the rust from the angle tube and the screws, which the screws have been darkened with steel blackener and are everything given a copious bath of WD-40 on the angle tube and any ferrous metals that might rust again, so this thing will last a while longer. There really isn't any markings to see externally. I should note that the harness tabs are a different rubber composition than the facepiece, this being a fabric-lined sort of Macintosh rubber, almost. It's sort of industrial. But again, there really isn't too much else to see on the exterior. So let's move on to the inside of the mask, being careful, because this mask is very fragile, very old, and very valuable. It's very, very floppy. So inside the facepiece, there is basically nothing. As you can see, it's just completely barren. You can see the spot where a set of TISO deflectors originally would have attached on the angle tube assembly, however they are not present on this mask. I remember when, during my first visit with Moulage, when he first brought this thing over for me to look at, I sort of flipped my shit because I was like, oh my god, it has an Acron TISO angle tube assembly, and yeah, I was a fucking moron. This is actually a KTM, or a Burrell Cops type angle tube assembly. It's very similar to the Acron TISO because it has the rounded hose joint, but the main difference is that the flutter valve post is angled at a slightly lower pitch instead of jutting out further. But anyways, more onto the interior. If you look closely, you can see, or hopefully you can see, the original pen marks that JJ must have drawn when he was creating this mask or cutting the sheet rubber to assemble it. And it's very interesting that that's like the only marking I could sort of say exists on this thing, is just all of the pen marks where JJ was drawing out the template for this thing and cutting it. And you can also see the chin seam, how it runs on the inside here. And again, another shot of the angle tube, hopefully you can see. The angle tube is sort of interesting. This design feature is interesting because the way he attached it, he did sort of the wire and tape method, but this is the most fragile part of the mask right here, more than likely, because he wired it on, but he didn't put any tape underneath, and then he also put a rubber band. He just glued it right on top of the wire, so I don't think it's rusting underneath, or hopefully it's not, but everything is dry rotting, and it's pretty much impossible to remove that without damaging the facepiece, so I will not. Because I did want to remove this angle tube assembly to polish it up, but being that everything is cemented in place, and I cannot remove it without tearing some of the dry rot, I am not going to attempt it. So that is pretty much that for the Koroseal Repro. I don't even want to call it a Koroseal just because of how marginally different it is from the concept of the Koroseal, but you know what? It's JJ's legacy, more or less, so we're going to attribute it to that, just for his sake. So, that being said, hopefully I've documented as much of this mask as I possibly could, and you've learned a thing or two about the history of gas mask collectors and their weird origins and such. So, that being said, I'm Duke Nugget 3D. Hope you all enjoyed. Be sure to leave any comments, questions, corrections, or concerns down in the comments below, and I will see you all later.